it knowledge in some sense. And again, I say this because once you place the workings of receptivity outside the space of reasons, to this extent it's unclear how it can become available for awareness. I think we want to avoid, in any case, the contradiction involved in saying that religious experience is both intentional, about something, the holy, let's say, and that it is independent of concepts and beliefs. But then that means that God, the holy, is already being specified under a description. We are already making an inference to the best explanation when we describe an experience as religious. Indeed, for most people, the very act of distinguishing a religious experience as religious is due to the belief that the best explanation of what happened is that it is due to non-natural causality of some sort. And people infer that belief from other beliefs that they hold. There is another really hard question here, in addition to the one I called the sense in which experience reflects non-conceptual content. The second and related hard question, with which I now close, is whether there can be non-inferential judgments, and where a Whiteheadian interpretation would want to go on this question. We know from David Griffin that on the basis of Whitehead's prehensive doctrine of perception, quote, there is no reason to deny and many reasons to affirm that we do directly perceive a holy actuality, end quote. I am frankly not sure what to do with this. I'm inclined to think that when we say we directly experience a holy actuality, we are issuing a judgment. That judgment then stands in inferential relations to other beliefs and concepts that we must have mastered in order to have any one concept. For me, that is one reason to deny that we do directly perceive a holy actuality in any desired sense of directness or immediacy. Nevertheless, I think, in conclusion, we can all say that there is no reason to deny and many reasons to affirm that David Griffin's work in the philosophy of religion will continue to stimulate and inform the field for a long time to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Another person who's not challenged anything I said, so I'm kind of at loss how we're going to fill the time here. But I suspect we will, and I assume we'll go over at least 15 minutes, given the fact that dinner will have to be later, and it can be a little later. Okay. Genuine religious experience. I do use the term holy reality and holy power as what I consider generic descriptions. I don't think I used cosmic mind or loving holy actuality as generic ones. I mean, that would be much culturally conditioned views. On this question of knowledge, now certainly Whitehead himself, not an appeal to authority, but just in a factual statement, Whitehead himself referred to knowledge to come from religious experience. This is in Religion in the Making. By the way, we learned that Whitehead had meant to write a much longer book on religious experience, on religion. So he was very, very interested in this subject, and his president, Conant at Harvard, talked him out of it and told him, write a little book, and that was probably a good, in any case, no specifically religious experience. I've argued that there is. The case of Proudfoot and Taves, both of whom say no, that religious experience is, and used Taves' term, if we don't necessarily answer the question, but we just leave it aside as a good religious studies person and say we're going to call it deemed religious, is deemed as a religious experience, and therefore that's what we mean. So we're not saying there was really a holy reality. We're not saying there wasn't. I'm at a handicap here because even though Ann Taves and I had offices right together for, I don't know, a decade or so, and we used to talk a lot. She even came and sat in my parapsychology class when she was working on her book, on her earlier book, working with James and who am I trying to say? Anyway. But we recently, now that she moved to Santa Barbara, I see her much less. And but she got very fascinated with the fact that I got involved in 9/11. So every time we meet, she starts talking about that. Oh, she met so-and-so, and have you ever heard of this guy named David Griffin who does this? She says, yeah, actually, not only have I heard him, I actually know him. And, you know, so we've not got in a very quick conversation. I have not gotten involved with it, and I haven't read her book. So I apologize for that I can't say anything about her book. I'm sure it's a very important book. The question of you're suggesting a definition of superhuman experiences. I'm afraid I would consider that neither sufficient nor necessary. It's not sufficient, you know, just as you could say some other definitions were tepid or something. It's not sufficient just to, if somebody said, well, I had an experience of some superhuman experience, it wouldn't necessarily be a religious experience. It might be a very interesting experience, but not called religious. Wouldn't think of it as life-transforming experience or anything like that. Also neither necessary, because many things that we would generally call religious experiences don't have any reference to a superhuman agency. Let's think of emptiness or nirvana, and some of the experiences described by James in his Varieties book. And I'm tempted here to call on John Cobb. Would you want to tell your experience? Yeah, come up if you're willing to. It's such an interesting experience that has stuck with me all these years.
I think I know what experience you're
One where you just sat down, you kneeled down to pray.
Okay, all right. I thought that's what he was saying. Now, I'm not one who has practiced in such a way that, you know, I've achieved mind-altering states or anything of the sort. There was a reference to our time in Esalen, and frankly, nothing happened to me through that breathing exercise. So I don't ordinarily present myself as an example of one who has had religious experience, but I think many of us have at one time or another in our lives had experiences that were extremely meaningful and rich at the time. And you mentioned something about I'd been engaged. I have tried to figure out why that particular experience occurred when it did, and I really have no idea. The only distinctive practice I was engaged in at the time was sort of holding up people who I met or saw and asking God's blessing on them. It's a very simple exercise that many of you may have. Whether that had anything to do with what happened, I simply have no idea, because I don't know any connection. I don't claim a causal relation, but I try to offer that, maybe. Maybe it has something to do with it. So it's simply, as I knelt to pray, and before I'd even begun to pray, the room simply felt like it was completely occupied by a presence. And the experience was one of total acceptance, total affirmation, total love. And I've thought often, I've wondered how one could put up with living forever. I thought, well, if it felt like that, it would be all right. And so it is an experience that has never been repeated, and as I was telling others, although I certainly felt it was God's presence, I still think it was God's presence. I have no particular skepticism about it, but on the other hand, a couple of years after that, when I went to the University of Chicago, my whole belief system collapsed. And remembering that event didn't suddenly, say, oh, well, there must be God because. So I believe it's a direct prehension. And I don't see that the fact that I know it's a judgment makes it. I make lots of judgments that I'm directly prehending things. And I don't see that makes it unlikely that I really am directly prehending something. The fact that it's a judgment doesn't seem to me to weaken the case. I regard it as a religious experience, and specifically an experience of God's presence. That's how I regard it. That's a judgment. I don't have any question about that. That's not, I'm not stating a self-evident fact.
But later, the question of presence, later when you went to the University of Chicago, you thought you no longer could say, well, that was present of God or any agency, because, exactly. But the experience still occurred.
The experience still occurred.
It was still a religious experience. Sort of.
I don't care what you call it, religious or not. Religious is not an important word in my vocabulary. So, yeah. But God is an important word in my vocabulary. I didn't experience religion. I experienced God. Okay.
Okay. So I take that as an example of something where it was not a necessary experience to talk about a superhuman agency. Now, he at the time thought, because that was his worldview, he thought of it as the presence of God. But after he no longer thought that for a few years, the experience was still there. Now, with regard to Tay's view, then, her category of specialness, I would say that that's necessary. It has to be some sort of special experience, but not sufficient. So what you're calling kind of tepid would be a way of putting it as not sufficient. Now, this question of judgments, certainly we're making judgments if we call something a religious experience. Of course we're making a judgment. If we made an inference that it was God, that's an inference. If we say, well, I experienced the Buddha, that was it. Anything like that. And I don't think those kind of concepts go all the way down. I don't assume that Lynn Margulis's bacteria have any judgments or any concepts about religious experience. I don't even think our West Highland Terriers have such experience. So it's a pretty fairly, probably mainly almost uniquely human kind of experience, at least on our planet. So I didn't get the connection there about what was it about the fact that we were making judgments using concepts that. And this other thing, point you made about the causal efficacy, you said can we deal with the working of presentational immediacy and of causal efficacy outside the space of concepts? I don't understand that. We're talking about concepts when we talk about perception in the mode of causal efficacy. So you'll have to clarify that for me, if you can.
Well, quickly on that question, then I want to get back to John. The question about causal efficacy is to what extent it can be utilized as data if it is pre-linguistic, pre-conceptual, because anything that we want then to say about it would be linguistic, would be descriptive, would employ concepts. So if it is regarded as being located outside the space of concepts, in the space of causality alone, I don't know that it's available
Let me just
to do the
I would
work.
say the experience of red is pre-linguistic. We then have the term red, but that doesn't prevent the experience of redness from being pre-linguistic. So I don't get the problem.
It's a knot that would take a long time to unravel. We could go on with that. I guess let me put it this way. The matrix of experience and interpretation in our lives is so enmeshed, almost holistically so. If you tug on any one strand that you think is experiential, all the other descriptive terms, interpretive overlay, concepts by which we learn the word red swim into view. And it does not repay our time, I have learned, to try to find a dividing line where causality leaves off and creativity begins, and even that border of pre-linguistic or pre-conscious and conscious is a fuzzy one. But I think what we do want to allow for theoretically, and this is where I think your work, David, on religious experience, in which you resist any, I take it, strong constructivist program, can be helpful in saying that in part experience or perception in the mode of causal efficacy, to put it that way, does supply the content of experience. It is not all interpretive overlay. But neither can we do anything about that experiential receptivity apart from the interpretive categories of the mind. I don't mean to sound Kant here, but I'm not sure I want to go pre-Kantian either. I mean, it's really, I think, a long-standing problem, and I think Whitehead gave us some very good tools, but only for describing components, not for going about the work that, now if I can get back, I don't mean to pick on you, John, but the salient point to me is the fact that you said, yes, you did deem it religious, but until you did that, I would have been at a loss to know what to regard it as. Was this an experience?
I didn't really deem it religious. I said I deemed it an experience of God.
Well, all right. God as a superhuman agent of some sort, yeah. So then it does, in the stipulated definition that I use, actually I don't use it for people like you, and I don't use it for the ground-to-being theologians, that's a whole different thing, or any of the revisionist forms of theism that I regard as so interesting. But if one is asking a very different kind of question than a theological one, namely what to do with the reports that we find around the world from people inside and outside of religious traditions who claim to be having bizarre, anomalous experiences of one kind or another. Do we have to accept all those reports at face value as being religious, or how do? I don't find any help in the sui generis school of thought, or the phenomenological tradition, or any common core hypothesis that would try to describe, as William James started out sounding like he was doing in the Varieties, some features that are always and everywhere a part of a religious experience, and you check them off, and then you know. There's just no way to cut through or to find a natural joint somewhere for whether to call John's experience religious, or a feeling of peace, or a euphoric moment when he found himself overwhelmed and overworked at the University of Chicago in McKeon's class, I believe, you know, or anything about it. I wouldn't presume to know. So the fact that he uses a religious tag, God, also tells us something about the causal attribution that he's making. Yeah, yeah, and but well, psychologists would, you know, use a different vocabulary. Anthropologists would use a different vocabulary. People, so. Yes.
Let me come in. No, stay right here. Stay right here. I gave two other examples. I talked about emptiness and nirvana. So I take it that those are not generally understood. And Gene Reeves is down here and can say something about this maybe. Would you say that we can't call those religious experiences because they're not the experiences of a superhuman agent?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because actually the Buddha is a superhuman being, and it's just Durkheim that screwed us up into thinking that he's not, and that this is a different kind of tradition. The Buddha, in all of the most ancient legends, is described as performing acts that you and I cannot do. He's born out of the side of his mother, who's impregnated by an elephant in one account, and then he addresses all the cardinal directions. But so I know, but I think that those experiences are embedded within an historical context and conditioned by a history of text and interpretations that are part of the legend. So it's an interesting question from the viewpoint of the study of psychology, maybe. What are the brain states of those who are meditating, and what is, but you can't really discuss that either, I don't think, without a knowledge of the ancient text and the discussion about nirvana, and what the Buddha taught, and who the Buddha was. So it's not something that happens in a void or without a context, that can be studied, and certainly probably affects the adept who uses that vocabulary. I'm just suddenly aware that John Cobb is all that stands between us and the cocktail hour. So that I certainly am happy to cede my time to his paper.